Somebody knocked. Past midnight. The rain had been falling since noon. It was a year when the creek went dry in July. Every door on that street was barred. Nobody in that town had enough to feed themselves, let alone a stranger. "Don't open that." That was her mother, from the back room. 26 years she had held that house. But the girl was 20. She took up the lamp and she opened the door. There was a man on the step. No coat worth the name. Boots gone through at the seam. Mud to the knee. "Can you spare a bed tonight?" She asked him nothing. She set a bowl of stew in front of him and let him eat it in peace. He was gone before first light. 3 days later, the deputies came up that street with a paper in hand. They pulled the roof off that kitchen. They took her mother to the county jail. And the girl sat down in the mud of her own yard. She could not name one thing she had done wrong. So what happened to that house? And what did a stranger leave behind that was worth tearing it down over? This was the autumn of 1891 in a valley called Sage Crossing. To tell it right, we have to start with the weather. Because that year, the weather decided everything. It did not rain in May. That happens. Folks planted anyway. Then it did not rain in June either. And the wheat came up thin and yellow and never got past a man's knee. By the middle of July, the creek that named the town was a line of dry stones. The first cattle went in August. A man would drive 9 head to the railhead and come back with the price of 4 because everybody in 3 counties was selling at once. And the buyers knew it. By September, there were families in that valley, eating twice a day and calling it 3. And the whole time, there was grain in Sage Crossing. It was in a long tin-roofed warehouse at the north end of the street, and it belonged to Cyrus Dayton. Dayton had come out in '84, and he had not made his money on cattle like everybody else. He made it on storage. He put up the only weather-tight warehouse between the bend and the railhead, and for 7 years. Every outfit in the valley had paid him to hold their surplus. That summer, he stopped selling. He did not raise the price. That was the clever part. He simply had none available. And then he had a little at a fair figure. And then he had none again. Old Otto Bram put it plainest. Sitting in the eating house with his hat on his knee. He's not gouging. He is. No, ma'am. Gouging's when a man names an ugly number. Otto tapped the table. This fella just keeps the door shut and lets the number name itself. The eating house was 2 doors down from the livery, and it had no sign at all. It did not need one. You could find it by the steam. A little before 5 every morning, the lid came off that stew pot. The steam went up under the eave and rolled down the whole length of the street. Men coming off the night at the livery would stop in the road without meaning to. The woman at the pot was Ida Garrity. She was 44. She had come to that valley at 18, married at 19, and buried her husband. The winter her daughter turned 8. 26 years she had stood at that stove. And beside her was Nell. Nell Garrity was 20. Dark hair pinned up out of the way. Sleeves rolled and shoved back past the elbow. And a strip of clean linen wrapped around her right hand. Wrist to knuckle, the way it had been, for as long as anybody in that town could remember. The pot was cast iron, and it held 40 gallons. And it did not come off the fire. That was the whole business. It went on the fire in October, and it came off in May, and whatever there was went into it. Beef when there was beef, barley and marrow bone when there was not. The linen came off, Nell's hand on Sunday nights, and went back on Monday mornings, clean. Otto asked her about it once, early that autumn. "Why don't you leave off ladling and let your mother do it?" "Because she's 44 and her knees are worse than mine." "That's not an answer," Nell went on stirring. "When it spits, you want to pull back," she said. "If you pull back, the pot goes over. So you don't pull back. And that's why the hand. Otto looked at her a while. Girl, that's the kind of thing a person says once and then lives by for 40 years. Then I'd best mean it, Nell said. Now here is the thing about that eating house, and it matters later. So hold on to it. They never asked a man for money at the door. You sat down. You got a bowl. If you had a coin, you put it on the table when you were done. And if you did not, you went out the same way you came in. And nobody said anything about it. That was Ida's rule from her husband's time. Food's not a trade, she used to say. It's a thing you do. But Nell kept a book. It was a plain ledger with a hard blue cover, and she kept it under the counter and in it. She wrote down every bowl that went out unpaid, the date, the name if she knew it, the number of bowls. Ida hated that book. What are you doing? Writing it down. Her mother came round the counter to see. We don't charge. You know we don't charge. I'm not charging anybody. Then why write it? Nell did not look up from the column. Because if it's not written down, in 10 years, nobody will believe it happened. Ida stood there with a rag in her hand. Believe what happened? That the town got fed, Nell said. And who did it? By the first week of October, there were 4 pages of it. Then 5. Then 11. Some nights the pot went out at 100 bowls, and 40 of them went into that book. Ida stopped arguing about it around the middle of the month, mostly because she was too tired to argue about anything. There was one week in there when they ate the same as everybody else. Barley twice a day. Nell wrote that in the book, too, on the bottom of a page, small. Us. 6 bowls. Nothing owed. Cyrus Dayton came in on the 11th of October. He did not eat there. He never had. He came in about 4 in the afternoon with his hat in his hand. A man named Rafe stood out on the walk. He was pleasant about the whole thing, which was his way. Mrs. Garrity, Mr. Dayton, I'll be direct because I respect the both of you. He set his hat on the counter. The talk in this town has gotten unkind. About my warehouse. Ida wiped the counter. I've heard some of it. You've heard it in here. I hear most things in here, and you don't correct it. Ida stopped wiping. Mr. Dayton, I feed folks. I don't govern what they say while they chew. Dayton smiled at that. He had a good smile. Of course, only a room where a thing gets said over and over becomes the place the thing came from. You understand. In a small valley. Nell had come up beside her mother by then, with the ladle still in her wrapped hand. What is it you want, Mr. Dayton? He looked at her a moment, the way a man looks at a fence post that is spoken. I want nothing at all, he said. I want you to know I'm aware of this room. That's all. That's a courtesy. He put his hat back on, and he went out. And Rafe fell in behind him. Otto Bram waited until the door shut. That, he said, was not a courtesy. Now, that was the 11th. I tell you the date because 8 days later, it started raining, and it did not stop for 2 days, which, in a drought year, is not mercy. It is a joke. The ground had gone hard as a road all summer. It could not take water. What fell ran, and what ran took the topsoil with it. And by the second evening, the dry creek was brown and loud and up over its stones. The 19th of October was a Monday. Every door on that street was barred by 9 o'clock, not against the rain, against people. There had been men coming through the valley for a month by then, off failed claims, off the rail crews, walking east, because there was nothing west. A few of them had helped themselves to what was on a porch. One of them, up near the pass, had helped himself to more than that. So the doors were barred, and you could not blame a soul for it. It was past midnight when the knocking started. Nell was still up. The pot never came off the fire, and somebody had to sit with it. And that was always her. 3 knocks. Not hard. Then nothing. Then 3 more. Nell. Her mother's voice from the back. Leave it. There's somebody out in that. There's somebody out in that every night this month. A pause. Nell. I know what's out there. So do you. Then I'll look at him, and I'll know too. Girl. But she had already taken the lamp off the hook. She opened the door about a foot. There was a man standing in the rain with his hat in both hands, which she noticed, because a man who means you harm does not hold his hat. He was 50, maybe, gray coming in. He had no coat to speak of, and his boots had gone at the seam, and he was mud past the knee, and the rain was running off the end of his nose while he stood there. Can you spare a bed tonight? Nell looked at him. We haven't got a bed. Then a floor, a barn, anything with a roof to it. Have you eaten? The man did not answer that right away, which was itself the answer. She opened the door the rest of the way. Her mother came out of the back room while she was ladling. Ida stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and she looked at that man for a long moment. And the man got up off the bench, because he had manners. Ma'am, sit down. You're dripping on my floor. He sat down. Ida watched him take the first 3 spoonfuls. Then she went and got a blanket off her own bed. She put it on the bench beside him and went back to the doorway. You'll sleep in the storeroom. There's grain sacks. They're empty. They're dry. The door doesn't lock, so don't try it. Ma'am, I've no money at all. I want to say that before I take another bite. I didn't ask you. All the same. Ida looked at him. Mister, in this house you get the bowl first, and we sort the rest out after. That's the way my husband had it, and I've not changed it. She turned to go. There's more in the pot if you want it. He ate 2 bowls, and he did not talk much. Nell asked where he had come from, and he said east, and she asked where he was going, and he said west, and that was the whole of the geography. But at one point he set his spoon down and looked at the room, the counter, the pot, the 11 pages of blue ledger sitting out where she had left it. You keep books. Some. He was still looking at the 11 pages. What's in it? What went out and wasn't paid for? The man was quiet a moment. You mean to collect? No. Then why keep it? And Nell Garrity gave him the same answer she had given her mother, because it was the only one she had. Because if it's not written down, in 10 years, nobody will believe it happened. The man looked at that blue book a long while. No, he said. I don't suppose they would. He was gone before first light. The blanket was folded. The storeroom door was open. The rain had quit sometime in the night, and the whole valley was steaming. Nell went in to sweep the sacks back into the corner, and she stopped. There was something on the sill where the lamp had been. It was small. It was about the size of a thumbnail, and it was heavier than it had any business being. A ring, not a wedding band. It was a heavy, flat-faced thing, gold gone dull with handling, and the face of it was cut with a device she could not make out in that light. Some kind of shield, and letters around the edge of it that were too fine and too worn to read. She stood in the storeroom doorway with it in her palm. Nell. Her mother behind her. What have you got? Nell held out her hand. He left it on the sill, and Ida Garrity looked at that ring, and every bit of color went out of her face. How was he dressed? Mother. How was he dressed, Nell? You saw him. He hadn't a coat. His boots were through. His boots were through. Ida's voice had gone very flat and very quiet. And he was carrying gold. Nell looked down at it. He hadn't any money. He said so. He said so because a man with no money and gold in his pocket did not come by the gold honest. Ida put her hand out. Give it here. Mother. Give it to me. Nell did not. They stood there in that storeroom a while, the both of them. You know what they'll say, Ida said at last. Don't you? You're not a fool. You know exactly what they'll say. If a soul in this valley sees that in this house, they'll say we stole it. They'll say worse. They'll say we took it off him. Ida's hands were shaking now. There's a man dead up by the pass, Nell. 2 weeks ago. Nobody knows who did it. He isn't dead. He walked out of here at 4 in the morning. And who saw him do it? Nell had no answer for that. Take it down to the creek, her mother said. Throw it as far as your arm will go. Do it now, before the streets awake. And this is the part I want you to sit with. Because everything that happens afterward comes out of the next 30 seconds. Nell Garrity did not throw that ring in the creek. Not because she wanted it. She never once thought of it as hers. She did not throw it because of what that man had done. He had sat at her table and eaten 2 bowls of her stew. He had nothing at all to pay with. And he had gone out into the dark and left behind the only thing he owned. That was not theft to her. That was a debt being settled by a man who had nothing left to settle it with. I'll find him, she said. You'll do what? He can't be 4 hours gone. He's on foot and he's headed west. She closed her hand. It's his. I'm giving it back. Ida Garrity sat down slowly on a grain sack in her own storeroom. Child, she said, you have no idea what you are holding. She was right. Nell had no idea. And neither, that morning, did she. She went after him at 6 in the morning. She took the west road because that was the way he said he was going. And she walked it 4 miles out past the last fence line. And there was nobody on it. The mud held tracks for about a half mile. Then the road went to rock, and the rock told her nothing. She stood out there a while with the ring in her fist. Then she walked back. Now I am going to tell you who that man was, because you ought to know it well before anybody in Sage Crossing did. His name was Marcus Hale, and he was the governor of the territory. He had held the office 2 years by then. Before that, he had been a land commissioner, and before that, a long time before that, he had been a boy on a claim in the Nebraska Sandhills that failed twice before it took. He was not a popular governor. He had a habit that the men around him found tiresome. He went and looked at things himself. Twice a year, Marcus Hale put on a coat that had been through 3 winters, took the rings off his hands, and went out into his own territory on foot to see what was actually happening in it. His secretary hated it. His wife had made peace with it. He had done it 11 times in 2 years, and nobody had ever recognized him. And that was not an accident. A man in a good coat gets shown the town. A man in a bad one gets shown the truth. He kept one thing on him. He had to. A man traveling like that has no name and no paper on him. Any deputy in any county can take him up for vagrancy. And when that happens, he needs to prove who he is inside of about a minute. So Marcus Hale carried his seal ring, the territory's device, and his own initials cut round the rim, knotted into the lining of his shirt, where a thief would not think to look. That ring was worth about $40 in gold. It was worth the territory, if you knew what it was. He had meant to leave money at that eating house. He had none. You cannot carry money and beg a bed. The two do not go together. So he sat in the storeroom in the dark and did the arithmetic. Every honest man does at some point, and came out at the same place. He could take the meal and walk, or he could leave the only thing he had. He knew exactly what he was risking. He knew that a ring like that in the wrong hands does not go quietly. He sat with it in his palm a long while. And then he thought about a girl with her hand wrapped in linen. She wrote down the names of everybody she fed for nothing. He set the ring on the sill and went out. He would have said he was paying his bill. What he had actually done was hand a loaded gun to a woman who did not know it was loaded. Nell tried to find the owner. That is the part I want to be very clear about. She did not hide it. She did not sell it. She spent the next 2 days trying to give it back. She asked at the livery whether anybody had seen a gray-headed man in a bad coat go west. Nobody had. She asked Otto Bram to look at the device on the face of it. That's a shield of some kind. Can you read the letters? Otto turned it in the light. I can read them. Their initials. M and H. He handed it back. Means nothing to me, girl. Could be any man in the territory. Then I'll ask somebody who'd know. And that is how Nell Garrity came to walk into Bern, Sayers Mercantile, on the morning of the 22nd of October, with the gold seal ring in her hand, and ask, in front of whoever happened to be standing there, whether anybody knew whose it was. Rafe was standing there. He was at the back by the harness, and he did not say a word. And he watched that ring go from Nell's hand into Bern Sayers and back again. Bern Sayer held it up to the window. Where'd you come by this? A man left it. For his supper. For his supper. Bern turned it over. Girl, this would buy his supper for a year. That's why I want it back to him. He looked at her over the top of it. Then he looked at the 2 men standing by the stove, and something went careful in his face. I've no notion whose it is, he said. He put it in her hand and closed her fingers over it. And if I were you, I'd not carry it up and down this street asking. Why not? Because I've no notion whose it is, Bern said again, and neither will anybody else. Nell thanked him and went out. She thought about that on the walk home. She decided he was being unkind about a stranger. He was not. He was being kind about her, and he was too frightened to say it plainer than that. Rafe waited about 4 minutes. Then he went out too, and he did not go home. Rafe found him in the warehouse office a little after noon. There was a stranger through here in the storm. Deaton did not look up. There's a stranger through here every night this month. This one stopped at the Garrity place and stayed the night. Nobody saw him come. Nobody saw him go. Rafe shifted his weight. And this morning, the girl's in Sayers with a gold ring, asking whose it is. Deaton put his pen down. A gold ring. Seal ring. Letters cut in the face of it. Deaton had not moved since the word ring. What letters? Sayer made it M and H. Deaton sat very still. Describe it. Gray. 50 or thereabouts. Bad coat. Boots gone through. Rafe almost smiled. A beggar, Mr. Deaton. A beggar. Deaton got up and went to the window. Rafe, what does a beggar want with a seal ring? Stole it, I'd say. Or he owns it. Rafe did not have anything to say to that. He came in on the worst night of the year, Deaton said. Nobody saw him arrive. Nobody saw him leave. And of every door on that street, he stopped at one. The house that feeds this town for nothing. And writes down who came. That's just where the food was. Is it? Deaton stood at that window a long while. Rafe, go and find out what's in that book. You understand what he saw. He did not see a girl trying to return a lost thing. He saw a man who had come in quiet, spent one night at the only place in town that keeps records, and left a mark of authority behind. And he saw a household now making very sure the whole street knew about it. 4 months of held grain. And a written ledger of hungry people sitting 2 doors from the livery. Cyrus Dayton did not sleep that night. In the morning, he went to see the deputy. They came on the 25th, 3 days after the mercantile. It was a Thursday, and it was clear and cold, and the whole street was out. Deputy Purvis had a paper in his hand, and he read it out on the step. And he did not look at either of them while he did it. Possession of stolen property. A gold seal ring taken up. In an inquiry into the death of a man on the Pass Road in September. That's not, Nell started. Ma'am, he gave it to us. He left it. He'd nothing to pay with. Ma'am, you'll have your say in front of the judge. Here is what they did to that house. And I will tell it plain, because it was done in front of 40 people. They took the ring. Then they took the ledger, because a record of who ate there was in the paper's words, material to the inquiry. Then they went in after the rest of it. They turned out the storeroom. They pulled up 2 boards in the floor of the kitchen. And when a man came out and said the stovepipe was a place, a thing could be hid, they took a bar to the roof over that stove and opened it to the sky. You do not need to tear a roof off to search a kitchen. They did it because Cyrus Dayton needed that house to stop being a place where people gathered. Ida Garrity said one thing that entire morning. When Purvis put his hand on her arm, she looked at Nell, not at him, and she said, "Keep the fire." That was all. Then she went down the street with 2 deputies, and she did not look back, because she had decided she was not going to let this town watch her do that. The county jail was in Marrow Creek, 11 miles east. They held her without bail because the charge was tied to a death, and the circuit judge did not come through again until spring. Spring was 5 months off. Nell sat in the mud of her own yard until about 2 in the afternoon. Then she got up because the pot was still on the fire, and there were people coming at 5. There was no roof over that stove. It had rained the night before, and the wood was wet. It took her 40 minutes to get a flame that would hold. She did it with her hand, wrapped in the same linen she had put on that morning, before any of this. At 5 o'clock, 11 people came. At 6, there were 4. By the end of that week, it was 2. Both of them were Otto Bram. He came at noon, and he came again at 6, and on the 3rd day. She called him on it. "You've eaten already." "I have." "Then why are you here?" Otto sat down and put his hat on his knee. "Because if one body comes, you'll bank the fire and go to bed," he said. "If 2 come, you have to keep it up." Nell stood there with the ladle. "That's a lot of stew for an old man. I've a lot of years left to be hungry in." He picked up the spoon. "Fill it, girl. Now, before we go on, if you're still with me, do me one small thing. Tell me in the comments what you're doing while you listen. Somebody's always folding laundry. It's usually laundry. All right, back to that autumn. I'm going to move quickly through the next 3 years, because the shape of them matters more than the days. The town stopped coming, not all at once, and not out of cruelty. It went like this. A man does not want to be seen going into the house that the deputies opened up. He does not think of himself as a coward about it. He simply finds that he is eating at home this month. And once 4 or 5 men have found that, the rest follow, without ever deciding anything. By December, there was a word for that eating house, and the word was trouble. Nell kept the fire. She got the roof closed in November with tar paper and boards. She pulled off her own storeroom wall, and it leaked at the seam for 3 years. And she put a pot under the leak and emptied it, and never mentioned it to anybody. She took in laundry. She took in mending. She walked out to the Kessler place 2 days a week to help with their stock. 11 miles round in all weather. And every evening, the pot went back on. Some nights, nobody came at all. She kept it going anyway. She saw her mother once a month. 11 miles east, on foot, On the one day a month the jail allowed it. She carried a covered pail, and they let her pass it through. And the two of them talked for 20 minutes through a grate. Ida asked the same question every single time. Is the fire in? It's in. Good girl. That was most of it. 20 minutes, once a month, for 3 years. And a great deal of it was silence. The ring sat in an evidence box in Marrow Creek, and nobody looked at it. The inquiry it was supposedly attached to had gone nowhere, and everybody involved had quietly moved on. The ledger sat in the same box. 11 pages of names. Now, here is what Nell Garrity did not know, and would not know for 3 years. You already know that man was the governor. Here is the part underneath it. Marcus Hale did not come to Sage Crossing by accident. Back in August, his land office had received 4 separate petitions out of that valley. Small outfits asking for relief, all of them naming the same warehouse and the same man. That is not unusual. Petitions come in by the sack. What was unusual was the freight ledger. Hale's people pulled the rail receipts for the bend, because that is what you do. And the arithmetic did not work. There was grain going into that warehouse, and there was almost none coming out. And there had not been for 4 months. And yet, Cyrus Dayton's account in Cheyenne was growing. You cannot make money on grain you do not sell, unless you are not selling it here. He was moving it east at night, in small lots, and selling it out of the territory at famine prices, while the valley that grew it ate barley twice a day. To prove that, Hale needed 2 things. He needed the freight records, which he could subpoena, and he needed to know whether the valley was actually starving, because Dayton's letters to the land office all said the shortfall was mild and being managed, and the only way to know if a man is lying about hunger is to go and look at it. So the governor of the territory put on a bad coat. He walked into Sage Crossing on the worst night of that autumn. And here is the part I have been holding back on you. That knock was not a man looking for a bed. He had already walked the whole street. He had counted the smoke. He knew it before he ever came up those steps. 40 houses in that town with no fire lit in October. That tells a man everything he needs to know about a grain shortage. What he wanted to know was whether there was anybody left in that valley still feeding people. Because when Marcus Hale finally moved on Cyrus Dayton, and he was going to need one thing more than freight records, he was going to need a witness the whole territory would believe. So he knocked on the one door in Sage Crossing that still had steam coming out from under the eave, and a girl with her hand wrapped in linen opened it and fed him and asked him nothing at all. The circuit came through in April of '92. The hearing took a little under 2 hours. The county put it plainly. A gold seal ring of considerable value found in that house. Neither woman can account for it. The device is unknown to this court. The initials match no man on the county rolls. He let that sit a moment. And a man died on the pass road 6 weeks before it turned up. Nell told the truth. She told it 3 times, and it did not change once. A man came in the storm. He had nothing. He ate. He left it on the sill. And this man's name? He didn't say. Ashby's man turned to the room before he asked the next one. You did not ask the name of a man you let sleep in your house. No, sir. Why not? And Nell Garrity said the thing that she was right about. And that did her no good whatsoever, because we don't ask. There was no witness. That was the whole of it. Nobody had seen him come. Nobody had seen him go. Bern Sayer was called. He stood there, turning his hat, and he told the truth. And the truth did the damage. She brought it into your store. She did. Sayer turned the hat around once more. and asked what it was worth. No, sir. She asked whose it was. Mr. Say, did she or did she not put a gold ring in your hand and ask you about it? She did, but thank you. But she was trying to give it back. Thank you, Mr. Sayer. Otto Bram testified for them and was asked on the second question how long he had eaten at that house for free. He said 11 years. That was the end of Otto. The jury was out 40 minutes. Ida Garrity was convicted of receiving stolen property and sentenced to 3 years. Nell was 21. She walked back the 11 miles from Marrow Creek that evening and got the fire in by 9 o'clock because the pot never came off. Now I'm going to be honest with you about the next 2 years because they were not noble. They were long. She did not become a hero of that valley. Nobody wrote a song. She got up. She lit the stove. She fed whoever came, which some weeks was nobody. She walked the 11 miles once a month with a covered pail. She took in mending. The roof leaked at the seam, and the pot under it filled, and she emptied it. And the linen came off her hand on Sunday nights, and went back on Monday mornings, clean. That was the whole of it, for 2 years and 4 months. Cyrus Dayton came to see her in the February of '94. The valley had come back some by then. It had rained in '93, but the eating house had not come back, because a town's memory for that sort of thing is longer than a drought. He came in the afternoon, and he took his hat off, and he was, as ever, pleasant. Miss Garrett, Mr. Dayton, I'll not sit. I know you'd rather I didn't. He turned the hat in his hands. I've come to make you an offer, and I'd ask you to hear the whole of it before you answer. Go on. I'd like to buy this building. Nell said nothing. I'll pay $400, which is more than it's worth, and we both know it. And I'll pay it today. It's not for sale. There's a second part. He said it gently. Your mother comes up for release in October. It is within my power to make that October instead of December. There are people in Marrow Creek who take my meaning on such things. Nell stood at that counter a long moment. I want you to understand what he was actually offering, because it was not nothing. $400 and 2 months of her mother's life back. She was 23 years old. She had been alone in that building for 2 years and 4 months. The roof leaked. The town had a word for her, and the man offering was the man who had done all of it. And both of them knew that too, and neither of them was going to say it out loud. Why do you want it? She said. It's a good corner. It's a corner nobody's eaten on in 2 years. Deaton smiled slightly. Miss Garrity, I'd like the building, because I would like this room to belong to me. I've said as much before, in this same room, and I was honest about it then. He put his hat back on. Think it over. I'll come Thursday. She thought it over. She thought it over for 3 days, and I will not pretend she did not. She got the pencil out and did the figures on the back of a flower. Sack. And the figures said, take it. The monthly visit fell on the Tuesday, 11 miles east with a covered pail, the same as the other 28 times. 20 minutes through a grate. Nell had decided on the walk that she would ask her, straight out, Mother, he'll have you home in October if I sell in the building. Tell me what to do. She got as far as sitting down. You're carrying something. I'm carrying stew. Her mother did not say anything for a moment. Nell. It's nothing. Ida Garrity had been in that place 2 years and 2 months. She had learned to read a face through iron. Has somebody died? No. The questions came in the order they always came. Is the fire in? It's in. Then it's money, Ida said. Or it's a man. And you'd have told me if it was a man. Nell looked at the floor. How bad? It isn't bad. It's... She stopped. There's a way to make some things easier. That's all. I'm working out whether to take it. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Who's offering? And Nell did not answer that. And the not answering was the whole answer. And both of them knew it. Ida sat back on the bench. I'll tell you a thing, and then we'll talk about the roof. She folded her hands. I've had 2 years in here to work out what I'm sorry for. Do you want to know what's on the list? Mother. It's short. I'm not sorry we fed him. I'm not sorry you opened the door. She looked up. I'm sorry I told you to throw that ring in the creek. That was the sensible thing. It was the frightened thing. I've had 2 years to tell the difference. Ida leaned forward. Nell, whatever this is, don't do the frightened thing to get me out of a room. I'm 47, and I can sit in a room. You've been in here. I know exactly how long I've been in here. Her voice did not rise, and I'd sit the rest of it twice over. Before I'd let you buy me out with the one thing that proves we told the truth. Nell's head came up. I never said what it was. You didn't have to. Ida almost smiled. Girl, there's only one thing you've got that anybody in this territory wants. The guard called the time. At the door, Nell turned around. He says December otherwise. Then I'll see you in December, her mother said. And I'll want the roof fixed by then. On the Wednesday night, she went and sat on the step at about 2 in the morning. And what she kept coming back to was not the building. It was that if she signed that paper, 11 pages in a county evidence room would be the only proof left. The only proof that anything had ever happened in that room at all. And those pages belonged to the county now. And the county belonged, in most of the ways that counted, to Cyrus Dayton. If it's not written down, in 10 years, nobody will believe it happened. She had said that to her mother. She had said it to a stranger in the rain. No, she said out loud to nobody on her own step at 2 in the morning. Deaton came Thursday. She told him no. He was pleasant about that too. He said he understood entirely, and he put his hat on. And at the door, he stopped. Your mother's release is in December, he said. I want to be sure that's clear. It's clear. Good. That was the 8th of February. 11 days later, a rider came up that street with a leather case and asked for the Garrity house. He was a clerk out of Cheyenne, and he had a subpoena in that case. And it was not for Nell. It was for the county evidence room. I told you Marcus Hale was going to move on Cyrus Dayton. It took him 2.5 years, and I want to tell you honestly why. Because it was not carelessness. It was that a governor cannot indict a man for holding grain. That is not a crime. What Dayton had actually done moving territory. Grain out of the territory at night. Under freight bills that described it as something else, while certifying to the land office that the shortfall was mild. That is fraud, and fraud has to be built. Hale's people spent 92 pulling rail receipts. They spent 93 finding the buyers on the other end, in Nebraska and Iowa, and getting 2 of them to talk. By the winter of 94, he had the freight. He had the buyers. He had the letters Dayton had written to the land office. What he did not have was the thing that turns a ledger into a hanging. He could prove grain left. He could not prove anybody starved. Deaton's defense was written before the charge was. There was no famine. The valley was managed. Nobody in Sage Crossing went hungry. And on paper, he was going to get away with it. Because who counts a hungry man? There is no receipt for going without supper. The land office had 4 petitions and a lot of complaint. And complaint is not evidence. Now, in February of 94, one of Hale's clerks was going through county records out of Sage Crossing. He was after anything that spoke to conditions in that valley in 91. Weather reports, stock sales, death rolls, and in the Merrill Creek evidence room, in a box, attached to a closed inquiry, tied to a conviction nobody had thought about in 2 years. He found a plain ledger with a hard blue cover. 11 pages. Dates, names, numbers of bowls, given without payment. A day-by-day account, in one hand, of exactly how many people in that valley could not pay for food. In the autumn of 1891, the clerk read 4 pages of it standing up. Then he sat down on the floor of that evidence room and read the rest. Then he went and found a telegraph office. Marcus Hale came back to Sage, crossing on the 4th of March, 1894. He came in a coach this time with 2 men, and he had a coat on that fit him. He did not go to the courthouse first. He went up that street to a building with a patched roof and a pot on the fire, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which is how she knew him before she knew him. Nell Garrity looked up from the stove. She did not say you. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You never came back for your ring." "No, ma'am, I did not. I looked for you 4 miles up that road." "I know it." Hale's voice was not steady. "I have known it for 11 days, and I have not slept much in them," he told her, standing up. He would not sit down until he had. "My name is Marcus Hale. I am the governor of this territory." Nell did not move. "I came here in October of 91 because 4 petitions had come out of this valley, naming Cyrus Dayton, and because I do not believe a man's letters about hunger. I walked your street before I knocked. I counted 40 houses with no fire in them. You counted. I counted." She had to sit down on the arm of the chair. "And then you knocked on ours." Yes. She already knew. She wanted to hear him say it. "Why ours?" "Because yours was the only chimney on that street, still making smoke," Hale said. "I needed to know if there was anybody left in this valley still feeding people." That is what the knock was. Mel set the ladle down on the edge of the stove. So it wasn't a bed. It was not a bed. And the ring. I had nothing else. I cannot carry money and beg a floor. The two don't go together. His hands were working. I sat in your storeroom for an hour with that thing in my palm. I knew what it was worth. I knew what it would look like in a poorhouse. You left it anyway. I left it anyway. Why? Hale was a while answering. Because you had a book under your counter with the names of every person. You'd fed for nothing in it, he said, and I could not walk out of a house like that owing it. So you paid us. Nell's voice had gone very even. With a thing that put my mother in a cell for 2 years and 4 months. Yes. Say the rest of it. That is the rest of it. Hale looked at her. There is no part of that I can make smaller. She asked one more thing. Did you know? While she was in there. Did you know it was us? No. Would it have made a difference? Yes. He said it flatly. It would have made all the difference. And it should not have taken a clerk in an evidence room to tell me. I did not look, Miss Garrity. That is my whole defense, and it is not much of one. Nell stood there a moment with her wrapped hand at her side. No, she said. It isn't. And then, after a moment, sit down. You're making my customers nervous. There were no customers. It was the first thing she had said to make anybody laugh in that room in 2 years. And Otto Bram, who was the only person in it, laughed until he had to put his hat over his face. The grand jury sat at Marrow Creek in May. The freight records made the case. The buyers in Nebraska made it worse. The letters to the land office made it unanswerable. But the thing the whole territory ended up reading about was the Blue Book. Dayton's counsel stood up on the second day and made the argument he had always meant to make. There was no famine in Sage Crossing. Counsel. I'll be brief, Your Honor. Every rancher in a dry year says he is ruined. It is a habit of the trade. My client is charged with starving a valley. And I say to you, there is not one document before this court, not one. Nothing that shows a single person in that valley went without a meal. He sat down. He was right. That was the trouble. There was not one. Your Honor, the territory would enter the account book of the Garrity Eating House. Sage Crossing, October and November, 1891. On what basis? On the basis that it is a contemporaneous record of want. Deaton's counsel was up before the prosecutor finished. Your Honor, an eating house ledger is a business record kept in the ordinary course, kept by a convicted, by a woman whose conviction this court vacated in April. That stopped him. The judge had it brought up. It was a plain book with a hard blue cover. It had been in a county evidence box for 2.5 years, and it smelled of it. Read it. All of it, Your Honor? You've told me it proves a valley starved. The judge sat back. Then prove it. The clerk read that ledger out loud in open court for 1 hour and 40 minutes. October the 2nd. Bram, 2 bowls. October the 2nd. Kessler, 4. Kessler, 3 children. 7 bowls. October the 3rd. A man off the rail crew. No name given. 1 bowl. Names, dates, bowls. Some of it he read twice. The room had gone so quiet that the back could not hear him the first time. 431 bowls given out for nothing in 9 weeks in a town of 211 people. And here is the thing that broke Cyrus Dayton, and it was not the number. It was that the woman who wrote it down had not been charging anybody. She had no claim. She never sent a bill. She had written those names while her own mother stood over her, telling her to stop wasting the ink, and there. It was, in one hand, at the time, by somebody, with no earthly reason to invent it. You cannot cross-examine a thing like that. There is nothing to attack. It is just the truth, sitting in a book, being read out slowly, in a room where 40 people are recognizing their own names. Nell Garrity sat in the 4th row. She listened to a stranger read out the winter she had almost not survived. She did not cry until he got to the 11th page. November the 29th. Us. 6 bowls. Nothing owed. Cyrus Dayton was convicted on 11 counts. He got 9 years. The warehouse and its contents were forfeit to the territory. The Nebraska buyers settled. Otto Bram was in that room when it came in. He was 71 by then, and he had walked the 11 miles. 9 years, he said, out on the walk afterward. He'll be 63. He will. That's not enough for what he done. No, Nell said. It isn't. Otto put his hat on. So what was the good of it then? He's counted, she said. That's the good of it. Somebody wrote him down. And in the same week, on a review moved by the office of the governor, the conviction of Ida Garrity was vacated, the ring having been identified, the source having been established, and the state having no further interest in the matter. She came out on a Tuesday in May, at the front gate, in the same dress she had gone in wearing. Nell had walked the 11 miles. She had walked it 31 times by then, and this was the last one. Ida Garrity stood in the road and looked at her daughter for a while. You've got thin. So have you. I've had cause. Ida looked past her, down the road west. Is it true what they told me about the book? It's true. They read it out in front of everybody. 1 hour and 40 minutes. Ida was quiet a moment. I told you to stop writing in that thing. You did. Her mother's voice had gone strange. I told you every week for a year. You did. Ida Garrity put her hand out and took her daughter's wrapped hand. Careful, the way she always had. Is the fire in? It's in, Nell said. 2 years and 2 months, and every time I asked, it was in. Somebody had to keep it in. No, Ida did not let go of the hand. Nobody had to. 40 houses on that street let theirs go out, and not one of them was wicked for it. They were cold and they were frightened, and it is the easiest thing in the world. Then why did ours stay in? Because you were standing in front of it. Ida Garrity held on a moment longer, and then she let go. Then let's go home. The territory did 3 things that autumn, and I will give them to you in the order they mattered. The smallest first. There was a letter and a sum of money for the roof, and a formal expression of regret. And Ida Garrity read it once and put it in a drawer, and I do not believe she ever took it out again. The second, a public granary, went up on the north end of that street, on the ground, where the tin warehouse had stood. Territory held. Opened by the town in a bad year. And the third was that somebody had to keep the count of it. They gave that to Nell. The clerk who came up to tell her had been sent, expecting an argument about the money. There's a stipend, $40 the year. Who kept the count before? Nobody, ma'am. He shifted. There was nothing to count before. Nell picked the key up off the counter and turned it over once. Then I'll want a book, she said, not as a kindness, because there was a written record, 11 pages long, made in the worst autumn that valley ever had, by somebody who kept counting when there was no reason to and no thanks for it. She did it for the rest of her life. She would go up there with a lantern and a stick of chalk. She counted sacks and called the figures. Otto Bram wrote them down until his hand went, and then a school teacher did it, and then Otto's grandson. And in the winter of 1896, which was worse than 91, by every measure that can be written down, nobody in Sage Crossing went hungry. The first one back was a man named Ned Kessler. He came on a Thursday in June, about 4 in the afternoon, when there was nobody else in the room. That was not an accident. He stood inside the door with his hat in his hands a while. Mr. Kessler, ma'am, there's stew. He did not move. I heard my name, he said. I know it. In that courtroom. They read it out. He was looking at the floor. October the 2nd. Kessler, 4. Kessler, 3 children. 7 bowls. I remember the day. I've a boy that's 14 now. He was 11 that autumn. Kessler turned the hat once. He never knew where the food come from. I never told him. Mel went on wiping the counter. I stopped coming, he said. You did. It weren't because I thought you'd done anything. I know that. It were because... He stopped. He started again. There's no good end to that sentence, is there? No, Nell said. There isn't. He stood there in the doorway. And here is the part I want you to have. She did not make him say it. She could have. She had every right on this earth to stand at that counter and make Ned Kessler put it into words. And he would have done it. And he would have deserved to. She put a bowl down instead. Sit down, Mr. Kessler. It's still hot. He sat, and he ate it, and he could not look at her the whole time. When he was done, he set a coin on the table, and she let him. That was the Thursday. Friday, there were 4. Saturday, there were 9. By the end of that month, there was a line on the walk at 5 in the morning, and not one person in it, ever, said a word about the 2 years and 4 months. Nell never brought it up, either. That is the only reason it worked. By 97, there were 3 pots on that fire. She married late. She had 2 sons. She kept her hand wrapped to the end of her days. And she never once let anybody but herself change the linen. And she kept the book. Not the old one. The county never gave that back. It stayed in the record of the Dayton case. And it is, as far as I know, still in a box in Cheyenne. She started a new one. Same blue cover. Same 3 columns. Date. Name. Bowls. Given without payment. Her mother asked her about it one last time, near the end, sitting by the stove with a blanket over her knees. You're still at that. I'm still at it. We've money now, Nell. Nobody's asking to be forgiven a bowl of stew. Nell went on writing. I'm not forgiving anybody, she said. I'm counting them. Ida watched her a while. You know what that book cost me. I know exactly what it cost you. Nell put the pen down. And I know what it bought. So does every person in this valley who ate this winter. Her mother did not answer that. After a while, she said, read me the names. And Nell read her the names. So there it is. A man came in out of the rain and could not pay, and left the only thing he had, and it took the roof off that house, and put a woman in a cell for 2 years and 4 months. And the same house fed 431 bowls to people who could not pay, and wrote every one of them down, for no reason at all. And that was the thing that finally brought down the man who had starved them. I have turned that over a good many times. Kindness did not save anybody in this story. Kindness got that family ruined. Let us be honest about it. What saved them was that somebody wrote it down. Give the bowl without asking the price. That is the first half, and it is the half everybody remembers. But keep the count. Put the name on the page, because what is forgiven disappears, and what is written down stays. And one day, when it is, the only thing standing between a liar and the truth, somebody is going to open that book and read it out in a room full of people. Now let me ask you something. Would you have signed Dayton's paper? $400 and 2 months of your mother's life. On a February night, alone, with the roof leaking. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Rest easy now. There will be another one waiting the next time you come this way.